Assalamu alaikum. We are studying electronic commerce and I'm your instructor Saadat Nisar. We were discussing the digital signature technology, if you remember, during our previous lecture, and I showed you with the help of a diagram how we apply the pair of public and private keys to execute a digital signature. I introduced two terms also, that is hash function and message digest. Just to revise the concept, a hash function is defined as a one-way mathematical function. When we apply this one-way mathematical function on some text, the result is a number, and that number is called a message digest. A message digest is unique to each message. So therefore, if we change a text message even a little bit, there is a change of a comma or a full stop even, then consequently we'll have a different message digest on applying the hash function. So we use this concept of hash function and message digest in order to gain integrity. So in order to check whether a message was altered or modified during the transmission or not, we use this concept of hash functions and message digest, and thereby we can verify that this message has been intact. So just to revise what we did last time, I want to take you through that digital signature diagram once again, because this is a very important concept, a little bit intricate also, but I want you to understand it fully at this stage. Because once you understand it right now, then it would be easy for you to understand different electronic payment systems. Almost all of the electronic payment systems, they use cryptography, this digital signature technology, in one way or the other. Therefore, it is imperative that we have a full understanding of this concept. So you can see again on the screen, there is the slide before you which explains the working of the digital signature technology. First, the sender side would type a text-based message, the original message, and then on that text-based message, a hash function would be applied. Consequently, it would result into a message digest, a number, and you remember that behind this number there is a pattern of 128 to 256 bits. That means there are 2 raised to power 256 different message digests that can be generated against 2 raised to power 256 different text-based messages. That is an unimaginably high number, you cannot even calculate it. So that means that all different text-based messages, they are covered, and whenever we apply a hash function on a text-based message, that would always result into a unique message digest. So the message digest is thus obtained by applying the hash function. Then the sender uses the public key of the receiver. This public key is already known to the sender, either through the key server or the receiver may in advance provide his public key to the sender. Using the public key of the receiver, this original message, the plain text, that is encrypted. Therefore, it is converted into a confidential form, in a scrambled form. Then this scrambled message is to be signed digitally. For that, the message digest that we had earlier calculated, we apply the private key in that message digest. So therefore, when the sender applies his private key in that message digest that makes a digital signature. In this fashion, this scrambled message is now digitally signed. It is transmitted to the receiver via internet. The receiver has got this scrambled and signed message. First, the receiver would apply the public key of the sender, and thus he would reveal the message digest. Remember, whatever information the message digest was encrypted with the private key of the sender, that could only be decrypted using the corresponding public key of the sender. So when the receiver applies the public key of the sender and the message digest is revealed, plus the fact that there is a digital certificate of a reputed CA which authenticates the public key of the sender, at this point we can say that authenticity is confirmed. That would ensure, in fact, to the receiver that this particular message has come from a particular source or a particular sender. Then the receiver applies his private key, his secret key, which is only known to the receiver. This private key is applied on the scrambled message, and as a result, this message gets unscrambled. It is converted back to the plain text in an understandable format. After that, the receiver applies the hash function on this decrypted original message. Remember, this hash function is supplied to the receiver by the sender side along with the message. So on applying the hash function on the original message, again a message digest is resulted. Now the receiver tries to match this message digest with the one which the receiver had just revealed with the help of the public key of the sender. In case both these message digests they match with each other, that would confirm to the receiver that the integrity of this message is intact. In other words, this message has not been altered during transmission. Just in case the two message digests they become different, that would then indicate that during transmission somebody might have modified the message, and because of that modification we have a different message digest on applying the hash function by the receiver. So in this fashion we achieve authenticity, integrity, and as a consequence non-repudiation with the help of digital signatures. If you recall, I also gave you the concept key length, and I told you that key length is used to measure the strength of a cryptographic algorithm. In other words, we can specify a cryptographic algorithm in terms of key length. So there may be algorithms having 56-bit key length, 128-bit key length, etc. Now, here I would like to show you some of the important algorithms which are used in symmetric type of cryptography. So you can see a list of these algorithms on the screen. First of all, data encryption standard, that is DES. It is a 56 bits algorithm. That means the key length is 56 bits. Accordingly, this algorithm can generate 2 raised to power 56 different symmetric keys. Then next is IDEA, that is International Data Encryption Algorithm, and this is 128 bits algorithm. Again, I want to highlight that because the key length of IDEA is 128 bits, that means that 2 raised to power 128 different combinations of zeros and ones are possible. Consequently, we can infer that 2 raised to power 128 different unique symmetric keys can be generated by this algorithm IDEA. Then RC2, its range is from 1 to 2048 bits, and this is a block cipher algorithm. That means that it can encrypt the data in terms of bytes. It can quickly encrypt the data in blocks or in bytes. Next is RC4. Its range is from 1 to 2048 bits, and it is a stream cipher. Stream cipher here would indicate that this algorithm encrypts bit by bit. So although it is not as fast as compared to RC2, which does the encryption in terms of bytes, RC4, it does the encryption job bit by bit, but it is quite accurate, it is quite precise. Then Rindle, and its key length is from 128 to 256 bits. These were some of the symmetric key algorithms which are commonly used. Cryptography, although is a safe technology, it is quite reliable, but still there may be attacks that can be launched against cryptography also. And in case of symmetric key algorithms, there are 3 different types of attacks that have so far been identified. One is key search attack. It is also called brute force attack. Then number 2, cryptanalysis attack. And number 3 is system-based attack. So you can see in the slide, these attacks on symmetric key algorithms, they are listed before you. In case of key search or brute force attacks, the attacker tries to decrypt a message with the help of different possible symmetric keys. So the attacker would apply different possible keys one after the other to decrypt the message. So in case we are dealing with IDEA, which is 128 bits algorithm, then the attacker would apply different cryptographic keys which are possibly generated from this algorithm IDEA, and would try to decrypt the message accordingly. In case the attacker is lucky, this is possible that the attacker might be able to decrypt the message somewhere in the beginning or somewhere in the middle. But just in case the attacker has to apply and test all the 2 raised to power 128 different possible keys to decrypt the message, that is going to take even billions of years. This leads us to the conclusion that greater the key length, the more difficult it is for the attacker to apply the key search or the brute force attack. So just in case we increase the key length by 1 bit in case of IDEA, therefore if the key length is 129 bits, then there are 2 raised to power 129 different symmetric keys that can be generated, and that which have to be tested or which have to be checked or applied. So you can realize that by increasing the key length by 1 bit, we have increased the difficulty level for the hacker exponentially. Right? There is a branch of science which has developed in the past few years, that is quantum computing. So the persons who are experts in quantum computing, they can develop cryptographic algorithms, and they can also launch attacks on cryptographic algorithms. There is the second type of attack which I just mentioned, the cryptanalysis. In case of cryptanalysis, the experts in quantum computing, they can identify some mathematical flaw in the algorithm which a cryptographic system is utilizing, and then by using greater computing power and by using sophisticated mathematical techniques, it might be possible that an attacker decrypts a cryptographic message without having the cryptographic key. Such type of an attack is called cryptanalysis, and it requires a great deal of expertise. Then the third type of attacks which may be launched against symmetric algorithms are system-based attacks. In system-based attacks, the intention, the endeavor of the attacker is not to defeat the cryptographic algorithm. Rather, the focus of attack is on the cryptographic system itself. Therefore, the attacker would try to find out some deficiency, some flaw within the cryptographic system itself in order to decrypt a message. So in case we want to launch a system-based attack on PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, which is a famous cryptographic system, then some flaw in the cryptographic system would be tried to be identified, and then using that, the decryption might be attempted. So after having this discussion about symmetric key algorithm, let's talk about the asymmetric algorithms. So in the slide you can see some of the more commonly used asymmetric type of algorithms. First public key algorithm, you can see DSS, that is Digital Signature Standard, based on DSA, that is Digital Standard Algorithm, and typically its key length is between 512 to 1024 bits. Then RSA is another type of public key algorithm. It was developed in 1977 by 3 professors at MIT, the famous university in America. And then the third main type is elliptic curves. There are also attacks contemplated or possible on public key cryptography. And there are 2 such attacks that I would like to talk about here. One is the key search attack again, and the second is analytical attack. In case of key search attacks, the private key is tried to be derived using certain techniques. Okay, instead of applying the keys respectively, as was the case in case of symmetric key algorithms, here the attacker uses the public key, and using the public key, which is a key which is publicly known, using the public key, the attacker tries to find out that composite number which connects a public key with its corresponding private key. So therefore, using the public key, the attacker would try to derive, would try to find out a composite number with which both these keys are linked with each other, and then that composite number would be factorized. Factors would be made of that composite number, and using those factors then private key can be derived. Again, that is mathematically quite tough, but the experts in quantum computing can do that. This is not impossible altogether, and it is believed that the RSA algorithm, public key algorithm, which is 1024 bits, that may be factored because of the fast computers by the year 2020. Now, I would like to highlight one thing more at this juncture, and that is the increase in the key length in case of asymmetric type of algorithms does not increase the difficulty level for the attacker as much as it does in case of symmetric type algorithms, right? So there we saw that if we increase the key length just by 1 bit, the brute force, the key search attack becomes extremely difficult for the attacker. That difficulty level is slightly low in case of asymmetric type. So if we increase the key length to some extent, that would not increase the difficulty level that much in case of asymmetric type, because asymmetric is based on a different technique, on a different concept. Here we have a pair of keys, public and private key, which are associated with each other with the help of a composite number, and that situation is not existing in case of symmetric type. According to an estimate, the 128-bit RC2 symmetric key is probably much more stronger to break as compared to 1024-bit RSA asymmetric public key. Although 1024 is much greater as compared to 128, but because the asymmetric type is based on different concept, on different cryptographic techniques, therefore the greatness of this number as compared to 128 would not be really a significant thing as regards the key search attack. Then the next type of attacks that may be launched on the asymmetric type algorithms are analytical attacks. Again, in case of analytical attacks, some fundamental flaw in the cryptographic system itself is first of all identified, and then exploring that flaw, an attempt is made by the attacker to do the decryption. So with this background, with this concept about the symmetric, asymmetric type of algorithms and different attacks that may be launched against those, let's move on to our next major topic, and that is the electronic payment systems. As I mentioned earlier, almost all the electronic payment systems in one way or the other, they use this concept of cryptography, they use the digital signature technology, and there are different models that have been conceived in this connection, and inshallah in our coming lectures we shall be studying these different payment models. Even we might start in our today's lecture a payment system in this behalf. So in the screen before you, you can see some of the payment systems which are being used on the internet. First of all is the broad type, the credit card based payment systems, and these include the virtual PIN payment system, and then the SSL and SET based payment systems. They use the credit card for the payment purposes. And then next electronic payment system is electronic checks, which uses strong symmetric and asymmetric type of cryptography for payment purposes. Then electronic cash or e-cash, it has got a lot of potential for payment online. We shall study that also. Then micro payment systems like Millicent and Payward, etc. If time permitted, only then we'll touch upon these. Otherwise, we'll confine ourselves to the payment systems earlier mentioned. Before I start the first credit card based payment system, that is virtual PIN payment system, I think it can be useful if we see the working of the payment through credit cards. So in case, in the traditional sense, we want to make the payment with the help of credit cards, what are the various steps that are involved? You can understand those with the help of the slide before you. So in the slide, you can see there is a bank, a credit card issuer bank, the bank which has issued a credit card to an account holder in that bank on the request made by that account holder for the issuance of the credit card, and then having that credit card issued in his name, that card holder takes that card for shopping purposes, for spending the amount, and he shows the credit card to the merchant. That is the step number 2. You can see on the top. The merchant would confirm the authenticity, that is called the authorization step. The merchant would have a machine available, and the merchant would then swipe that credit card through that machine to check the authenticity and to confirm the authorization. The idea behind this is to confirm that this credit card has been validly issued, plus the credit limit has been properly sanctioned and the credit limit exists. This authorization is done through a card brand. So card brand, for example, Visa or MasterCard, these are the organizations in whose name the credit card has been issued, and the authorization job is done through these card brands. So the card brand, if the card Visa is being used, then the card brand Visa would confirm that yes, this card is valid and the credit limit is available, and the credit limit has not been extinguished. And then on receiving the confirmation from the card brand, after receiving the authorization, then the merchant would have certain slips signed by the card holder. So there would be certain slips that would emanate, and the card holder would be asked to sign these slips. Afterwards, the merchant sends or presents these slips to the bank in which the merchant has got its account. That bank, the bank of the merchant where the merchant has got his account, is called the acquirer bank. So in the step number 4, all different slips which the merchant has been collecting, all these slips, they are handed over, they are passed over to the acquirer bank, and that process is called the capturing process. The acquirer bank does this service for the merchant. For that, the acquirer bank may separately charge its commission from the merchant. The acquirer bank in step number 5 would make a payment request to the card brand. So if the card brand is Visa, then the company Visa would be asked by the acquirer bank to make the corresponding payment in the merchant's account. Accordingly, the card brand would do that payment, and that amount would be accordingly deposited in the account of the merchant in the acquirer bank. In the next step, the step number 6, the card brand would make the payment request to the credit card issuer bank. So the card brand, by adding up its margin of profit or its commission, would send a payment request to the credit card issuer bank, and accordingly the credit card issuer bank would transfer that amount to the card brand, and thus the card brand gets satisfied as regards the payment. Next, the credit card issuer bank would bill the credit card holder. So the credit card issuer bank may add some amount of interest, say 2%, 3%, etc. And then adding that amount of interest, the account of the credit card holder would be charged, or the credit card holder would be asked to make the payment. So that is a simple concept how the payment can be made through the credit card. Here I would like to point out the difference between the credit card and a debit card. Remember, in case of a debit card, you use your own money for payment purposes. So you go to a bank, you request the bank to provide you a debit card. If the bank can provide that service, that debit card would be issued to you, and then using that you can pay certain bills, you can spend your money. That is your own money, and that service, that facility is normally provided by the bank to its clients, to its customers, free of any charge, free of any cost. On the other hand, in case of credit card, you borrow the money from the bank. You are just a customer of the bank, you hold an account with the bank, and then you request to the bank to provide you the credit card. You get the credit card, there is certain credit limit which is sanctioned to you, and then using that borrowed money, you make the payments, you spend your money. Normally, in case of credit card payments, the bank imposes some amount of interest. So therefore, there can be 2%, 3% interest which is levied upon the payment that has to be made by the account holder, the credit card holder, to the bank. So in this fashion, the credit card issuer bank earns its revenue. It is not therefore free of any charge, as is the case with the debit card. So with this background in mind, let's have a look at the first credit card based payment system that was introduced, that is called the virtual PIN payment system. This credit card based payment system was launched somewhere in 1994, and it was introduced by a company called First Virtual Holdings. The key feature about this payment system is that it is very simple to use. There is no use of encryption in it, and there is no special software required on either side, no special hardware is required on either side. Therefore, where I want to buy an online article, an online magazine or online journal, it is suitable that I do the payment with the help of this virtual PIN payment system wherever this system has been applied. In case of virtual PIN payment system, both the buyer and the merchant, they must be registered with the company First Virtual. And both the buyer and the merchant, they get a pass phrase, an account ID called virtual PIN. So when the buyer wants to get registered with First Virtual, the buyer would supply the information about the bank which has issued the credit card to the buyer. The buyer would supply his email address, his name, etc. All this information is supplied through the internet to the First Virtual, and in response, the First Virtual would allocate an account ID called virtual PIN to the buyer. After the virtual PIN has been assigned to the buyer then makes a telephone call to the first virtual, and in that telephone call, the buyer tells the first virtual about the virtual PIN which was earlier assigned to him, and then the buyer also provides the credit card number through the telephone to the first virtual. So this point is to be noted that the credit card number, the credit card information, that is not provided through the internet, rather that is supplied by making a telephone call, because it is believed that the communication through telephone, it is much more secured, it is much more reliable as opposed to providing information through the internet. So in order to provide your sensitive credit card number, you use the telephone communication mechanism. Afterwards, the first virtual establishes a link between the virtual PIN which was earlier assigned to the buyer and the credit card number of the buyer. And this linkage between the virtual PIN and the credit card number, this information then resides on the databases in the first virtual organization. Similarly, the merchant also undergoes the same process. The merchant also needs to be registered. For that, the merchant provides the details about the name of the merchant's bank, the bank where the account of the merchant is lying, where the amount, the payment has to be transferred. That bank is called acquirer bank. And then the merchant provides his name, his email address, etc. All this information is provided through the internet by the merchant to the FV, and again the FV assigns a special virtual PIN to the merchant. In this fashion, we can say that both buyer and the merchant, they are now registered with first virtual. And so therefore, a payment request can be made by the merchant to the FV that some payment amount should be transferred in favor of the merchant from the registered buyer. Now at this point, I would like to show you a slide which illustrates the working of this model. Here you can see there are three different entities. At the bottom you can see there is the buyer who wants to do shopping online, and then on the left upper corner you can see there is a web server selling goods, the merchant who's selling his goods online, and on the right upper corner you can see there is the first virtual internet payment system server, or simply first virtual server. First virtual is going to play a backbone role in the transfer of amount in favor of the merchant. First virtual is going to play a backbone role in the transfer of funds from buyer to the account of the merchant. In the first step, when the buyer makes a selection of the items the buyer wants to purchase, then there may be a web form available before the buyer in which he would be asked to type his account ID or his virtual PIN. Accordingly, the buyer would provide this detail, his account ID, that is the step number 1. You can see this detail is provided to the web server, to the merchant. In step number 2, the merchant inquires the FV server about the validity of this ID. So there is a question asked to the FV in step number 2 whether this virtual PIN is valid, it is not blacklisted. What is your opinion? What is your feedback about it? So accordingly, in step number 3, if this virtual PIN is not blacklisted, it is valid according to FV, then the OK message would be passed over to the web server. So you can see in the step number 3, account OK. On receiving this OK message, in step number 4, the goods, the information goods, in this example, they are delivered to the buyer. So if the buyer is buying an online article, the buyer would be allowed to download this online article by the merchant. And simultaneously, in step number 5, the details of this transaction, they would be also provided to the first virtual server. The merchant would tell the first virtual that the information goods, they have been delivered, so please arrange the payment. In step number 6, the first virtual server would generate an email message for the buyer. It will be a question about the satisfaction of the goods. So there are 3 different possible answers to this email about satisfaction of the goods. The buyer can say, yes, I accept these goods, they are of satisfactory quality, so please proceed with the payment. That is one possible answer to this email of step number 6. Second possible answer by the buyer is that he rejects these goods. That would mean that the goods, they have been delivered, but they are of poor quality, and accordingly the buyer rejects those goods and the payment should not be arranged. The buyer can also specify that the goods have not yet arrived, he has not received the goods, therefore the payment should not be proceeded with. The third possible answer is that the buyer indicates the fraud, which means that the buyer tells the first virtual that the buyer had never placed any order as such. The buyer has no knowledge of any order, so therefore somebody has stolen the virtual PIN of the buyer, and by misusing that virtual PIN, the orders have been fraudulently generated in the name of the buyer. So again, on receiving this fraud indication, the payment would not be arranged. Assume that the buyer sends the message of acceptance that the goods are acceptable and the payment should be proceeded. Then in that eventuality, the FV would arrange the payment in the account of the merchant in the acquirer bank. And that arrangement of payment is made through automated clearing house, or ACH. It's a new term for you. Banks are electronically linked with each other through a centralized system called ACH, or automated clearing house. Therefore, the buyer's bank and the merchant's bank, they would be connected with each other through ACH, and using ACH, the payment from the account of the buyer would proceed and would be deposited in the account of the merchant in the acquirer bank. And then the merchant can physically withdraw this amount through ATM or through a check, etc., from his account in the acquirer bank. There are 2 main security loopholes in this system that I would like to talk about. One is that through eavesdropping, it is possible that somebody steals your virtual PIN. So that means that if some attacker has installed a backdoor or a Trojan horse, some malicious program, and which provides the details about the virtual PIN to the attacker, then it is possible that using that virtual PIN, the hacker, the attacker, carries out bogus transactions before that virtual PIN is blacklisted. Here, I should point out that when the step number 6 satisfaction email is sent by the first virtual to the buyer, in response to which the buyer can provide 3 different answers, as I mentioned. So, when this step number 6 email is sent, then normally some waiting period is maintained. So therefore there can be few hours, few minutes, or there can be few days, depending upon the policy of the first virtual, which would be kept as a waiting period. And during that waiting period, the buyer has to give his response to the email of step number 6. So assume that the waiting period is 2 days, the email is sent by the first virtual to the buyer, and for 2 days the buyer does not respond to that email. Or it is also possible that the hacker hacks the email account of the buyer. This is also a possibility. So in that eventuality, the policy is that the payment would be proceeded. Right? So there is then this possibility that when the virtual PIN has not been blacklisted as yet, and virtual PIN has been stolen, then the bogus transactions can be carried out using that virtual PIN till it becomes blacklisted. The second security threat is even more severe. In that case, the attacker steals the credit card number, and then using the particulars of the buyer, he gets a virtual PIN, then he establishes an email account also, and using these things, then the bogus transactions can be carried out by the attacker. So till the time the credit card is actually billed, the bogus transactions can be carried out by the attacker, and the buyer, the actual person, would not have any knowledge of it. We'll continue with this virtual PIN payment system, and we'll see what are the advantages, disadvantages of this system. We have to conclude our lecture for today. Our time is over. So until our next lecture, I say Allah Hafiz to you.